Hey guys, Pat here. Welcome to my favorite films of all time list. We've looked at 20 through 13, and now we're on number 12. Number 12 is, at this point, one of my not only favorite films of all time, but a film that I've spent more time researching and reading about than most films I'm a fan of. A lot of the time when I love a movie, I do a lot of basic research on it, like, who is the cinematographer, who edited the movie, who wrote the screenplay, what inspired the movie, try to find storyboards or concept art. Very basic stuff like that. I don't get too deep into it. But this movie, I think, is enriched by the knowledge you can get from researching it. I think it becomes a better movie, and it did for me. And I love the movie initially, like a lot of people. There's a very on the surface level way to love this film, but I think, if in particular because of what inspired this film and where a lot of the dialogue and where a lot of the story beats come from, it's a film that is almost really better if the more you know about it. Really, the more detail you know just makes the experience great. And for me, that is when art becomes something that's not only valuable and as entertainment or as a movie that makes you feel different about the world you live in and makes you think about things in a new way and opens your eyes up to things that you didn't know, and it teaches you things. It provides information. It's also just knowledge, education. You can learn from this film, and you can learn a lot of things, not just about the subject matter that the film is in the context of it, but also learn a lot about life and human behavior. And there's an epic story in itself and the outsides of this. So the movie I'm talking about that I'm alluding to here that I haven't brought up yet is Goodfellas, and that's about as cliche as a favorite film could be for a movie buff. There isn't a stand-up comedian I've ever heard talk who doesn't worship this movie. There isn't a film student, artist, anyone who hasn't seen this and doesn't just adore it for the most part. It's one of those movies. It's like bringing up Pulp Fiction. It's one of those '90s classics, but Goodfellas has a distinction. It kind of is one of the early films of the '90s boom. Because I thought the '90s was a great decade for movies. I thought it was a much better decade than the '80s, and it was closer to the '70s than the '80s was. And you're wrong. I love a lot about the '80s, but the '90s you were getting a lot more visionary filmmakers who were making more interesting statements and doing unique new things, and they were influenced by the MTV editing and all that stuff, and that kind of changed how movies were paced and put together. You can see this with every decade how movies subtly change. It's subtle changes, but you could see it at the beginning of a new decade or even at the end of the previous one. Before Goodfellas came out, the Coen brothers were kind of making a name for themselves with stuff like Blood Simple and Raising Arizona. And then in the early '90s, they got around to doing Barton Fink and Miller's Crossing and that. And they were starting to become auteurs immediately. And you could see their influences from literature, from film, from paintings. You just knew where their style kind of came from. But they still made it unique to themselves. And they were developing that. And it was kind of a deconstruction of a lot of the genre tropes we had gotten used to. And I think that led into the era of the Tarantinos and the David Finchers and the Spike Jonze and all these new filmmakers. I really think the Coens were there in a very early time. They were kind of like before grunge took off, and there was those bands that were big in the '80s before grunge really got mainstream. That's kind of how I picture the Coen brothers. Them with Sam Raimi, in those early days, were kind of at the cutting edge of a lot of what was going on in American cinema. But there was always the guy. It was always Scorsese. There was always him and De Palma and all the film brats. And Scorsese had a dominant signature run in the '70s. Okay, everyone in the '70s who was aware of what was going on with film at the time acknowledged Mean Streets and Taxi Driver. Then he ends that really because you kind of should count Raging Bull as more of a '70s film because it came out in 1980. You get Raging Bull, and that's just kind of like this masterpiece period at the end of an amazing sentence where this guy comes out and he does have a satirical edge to him. He does have a sense of humor. He has a unique perspective. He's influenced by the French New Wave with his camera work and his style. He likes to not really focus on plot. He's more about just personalities and people. Scorsese had pretty much mastered this, I feel, by the end of that decade. So he tried new things in the '80s. So we got some really interesting films that I adore. The King of Comedy is one of the best dark comedies you'll ever see. It features arguably the best performance by Robert De Niro, and it's one of Scorsese's more original films. It's a film that doesn't really fit in with his other movies in a similar way, and I like that. After Hours, amazing film, terrific. I think if Franz Kafka had made a film, that would have been that movie. With Griffin Dunne, terrific. Last Temptation of Christ, my favorite film of his that actually deals with religion, and I think one of the most interesting films about Christ. It's not my favorite. I prefer the Gospel According to St. Matthew by Pasolini, but I still think that what he accomplished with Last Temptation and some of the experimental stuff he did was great. So this all adds up. He's trying to see, Scorsese, if he can stay relevant. He talks about this in interviews: staying relevant, staying commercially viable. Can he still get movies made? He had to try to adjust to the decade that he lived in. So he comes back to the classic genre that he tackled in the 70s with a new maturity and perspective on everything. He was inspired by Nicholas Pileggi's book, which I could be getting Pileggi's name wrong, so forgive me for that, Wise Guy, which was based off the life of Henry Hill, a mobster that was very prominent at one time, was very involved in everything that was going on at one point in history when things were really changing in the mob in America at that time, and crime, not the 20s prohibitionary, and there really hadn't been a document about this stuff really in cinema. You had The Godfather, but The Godfather is almost taking all of those elements and adding this other layer on top of it, this layer of poetry and seriousness, and it's very Shakespearean, really. Like, they add all these layers and things to it, and you don't know how much of it's actually real and based off stuff that probably happened, or how much of it is just from the writers' minds and the filmmakers and the actors even. Just a collaboration of so many things, to where you can't even just simply identify The Godfather as a mobster mafia film. It's not. It's so many things. It's got broad strokes in how you can view the characters. And I adored that about that movie. What Goodfellas did, which changed everything, was the documentary-like approach to the material. And I believe Pulp Fiction kind of has that in the same way, but with Tarantino's unique voice and him kind of playing around with this world and being esoteric. But when you start at Goodfellas, you can see the pattern that leads into a lot of movies after Goodfellas came out. And it's still, to this day, why it's one of the best films of the 90s. It's one of the most important films of the 90s. And it's one of the greatest modern films, and one of the greatest films of all time, quite frankly. And in American cinema, there's been a few movies that have remained as potent and as visually stunning, engaging, and well acted. The cast is universally great. But there's a lot of things to praise about Goodfellas in a very generic way that everyone's praised it for. Oh, the tracking shots. Oh, the editing. It's amazing. The way it keeps turning into different movies. Robert De Niro's wonderful, really one of his last great performances. As A.O. Scott said, which is I totally agree with, he's been playing Jimmy Conway ever since he played Jimmy Conway. Because it's a terrific, fully realized performance. He is that guy. You believe 100% Robert De Niro is Jimmy, but the problem is De Niro was so happy with that performance. He's been doing that face, that delivery, even doesn't Meet the Parents. He's been playing that part now for almost every movie he makes for the last 20 years. It was one of his last original performances. But movies, I always feel, are like, it's like sculpting. You're starting and you're not quite sure what it's going to be, and you're going away at it, and then it forms into something else. What makes Goodfellas stand out from a lot of other movies is that the majority of the material that's in this film, in a film that's made as a movie, not a documentary, it's just kind of treated that way aesthetically, and how the actors approach it. It is dense with information that is true. Almost everything in this movie, I'd say over 85% of it actually happened. If you read the book and you check the sources, if you read more into this stuff, which I'm not going to go through here, you could do that in your own time, but there's a lot of stuff here. Even Henry Hill's appearances on Howard Stern throughout the years, there's a lot of it. What separates Goodfellas from a lot of other movies, and all writers and everyone who's an artist takes from their own life and from a lot of truth and is inspired by things, Goodfellas just jumps into the pool with that. Most of the dialogue is improvised. This is not a movie with a lot of with Scorsese and Nick sitting there and writing out these great monologues and these great comedic moments and all these wonderful little little stories in themselves. There's just short films within this film. They didn't write a lot of that. A lot of that actually happened. For instance, I'll use an example. Joe Pesci, the famous clown speech that he gives to Ray Liotta. That's not written. That's actually something Joe Pesci heard when he would hang out at bars with wise guys and stuff like that. Joe Pesci would hang out with these guys, and he heard that story exactly, and he saw it play out that way. And then you get a little, you go a little bit more hyper with it. You know, it's hyper reality. You're trying to kind of create a sense of tension that maybe wouldn't be there totally in real life, but you add these little layers to it of building tension. And that's the thing. So what makes Goodfellas so amazing as a movie, for me, outside of the filmmaking, because you know Scorsese's a great filmmaker. You know his films have great cutting and pacing and camera work and all that. That's in all of his films. Even if you're not a fan of some of his films, they're always technically brilliant, and the craftsmanship's always at world class. And he's honestly kept that up his whole career. I mean, his movies still look amazing and are well put together. It's the information here. You learn so much from this movie. This movie educates you. A lot of the stuff that's in this film is true to the process of how money is handled in these things, of how someone's going to get hit. The relationship between Karen and Henry, the wife and the husband working together on this, and her being turned on and slowly getting as involved in this as he is and enjoying it, and the aftermath of that. You learn a lot, not just about how these historical events played out, because history is such a great thing to pull from for stories, you know. And a lot of people in this generation, and I guess maybe the last couple generations, they don't seem as inclined to read about history or care about what happened, especially with the 20th century. It seems like a lot of things are skimmed over. A lot of significant things happened. And this is like a little time capsule of that world at that time and Henry Hill's perspective on it. You really get in his head because he's a real person that really did these things, you know. He really was a kid who got hit by his father for not going to school. He really was there when people got whacked. He was really friends with Jimmy and Tommy like that. Even though in real life, you know, Tommy was a giant guy, not little Joe Pesci. One of the weirdest things about Joe Pesci I've always felt in all of his movies, just to go on a little side thing here, is that he always plays these really tough, hardcore guys who could beat people up. And Joe Pesci is clearly a guy that anyone could beat up in 5 seconds with just a flick of the wrist. I mean, even going back to Raging Bull when he beats up the guy in the club, it's like, come on. But he's such a great actor, you get it. But it always kind of made me laugh. Like, yeah, what a tough guy he is. They didn't call the film Wise Guy because there was that film Wise Guys that De Palma had made with Danny DeVito and Joe Piscopo in the 80s. So they went with the title Goodfellas, which I think ended up being a little bit more iconic than calling it Wise Guy. I actually think it ended up being a better title. Ray Liotta was cast after his terrific work in Something Wild, the Jonathan Demme film. Scorsese was really into how intense he could be. And this is, to this day, I think probably his best performance is in this movie. He's just so well cast. You don't buy him as a 21-year-old when he clearly looks like he's 38 or something, but that's fine. Everyone's way too old to be playing their parts in this movie. There's a hilarious part where they try to allude that, like, Joe Pesci and him are the same age when they're young, and then they get older, and Joe Pesci looks so much older than Ray Liotta. It's just kind of jarring. But that's whatever, you know, it doesn't... The acting's so good you understand why they're cast. And they're supposed to be rough, older-looking people, you know, so it kind of plays into the illusion of the film. Goodfellas has so many little things to study. What does the red light mean? You know, what does the painting mean? What does all this mean? And it's crazy. All those scenes are improvised. Joe Pesci is improvising in that scene at the dinner table with the mother. You know, it's one of those great things when you find out that a great screenplay and a great story isn't always done in the script. There's always been the argument from a lot of people that the writer is the dominant force of the medium. You know, you can't make a great movie without a great screenplay. I'd say Goodfellas makes that argument the counterweight, that you can make a really great movie without a screenplay that's the focus. You know, a lot of what's here was not written in the script. They had the plot points in the story, but they took that from real events. So the story's from the world. It's not from the mind of these men. It's from the real world. Then within that, you have actors who are so committed to their parts and their characters and what's going on that they add another dimension and layer to it. Their brilliance as artists, what they can bring to the facial expressions and the way they talk about things and their own personal experiences in life. You know, these weren't men who lived boring lives themselves, so they were telling good stories, and they were able to learn a lot from the actual gangsters, you know, that they were playing. You know, there was a lot to learn from these guys. So they just had so much material, and when you have that much material, it's it's hard to screw it up. You have to really be a hack to not present this in a compelling way because there's so many compelling things here. But what I think separates this from a lot of other Scorsese films, which I think are uniquely him and his worldview, like Taxi Driver, I think of him and the screenplay and Paul Schrader's worldview. You know, their collaborations together. You got a sense of them that they had a feeling about the world and art and what they wanted to do. This isn't so much that, you know, Marty kind of gets lost in this movie, and that's one thing I love about it. You don't really think about him directing it, even though it has all of the wonderful filmmaking and craft that's been throughout all of his movies, all of the masterful stuff that's in this movie. Really, the camera work is truly exceptional. It's not just the lighting and all that. It's the way the camera flows through this movie, how people are presented, the blocking of it. It's not because the shots are technically well done. It's the information that is being given to you in those shots and how Scorsese has every beat hit, so you get a lot. You know, think about the scene where Ray Liotta's walking through the room and all the guys, he's telling you who each guy is. And then the guys are kind of saying hi to him. You're getting a lot there. You're getting kind of, with the tone of his voice, his point of view on these men, and now he's talking about them, and he's telling you about these men and giving information. Then you get their personalities and what they're doing in that moment, while you're also getting the room established, this club that's going to be used throughout the rest of the movie. There's a lot of things going on in that scene. Every scene of Goodfellas is that way. And that's because they had the information. So they were like, hey, all this stuff happened with Henry Hill and his babysitter when he was selling cocaine and the Pittsburgh connection and these phone calls and the cops watching him in the helicopter. That all really happened. So all you have to do is get the footage and kind of put the pieces together, you know? That doesn't mean there isn't a genius craft and work that went into this as a film. Obviously, I'm not trying to take that away. But when people praise Goodfellas, they always focus on that first. Like it was all original stuff or something. Like Martin Scorsese just like made all this stuff up and it was all... No. A lot of this stuff is just stuff that's a real account that he can relate to as a guy from New York that had been around people that were kind of wise guys and stuff like that. It's not that Scorsese was a tough guy, but he knew this kind of world. You know, he knew the dirtiness of it. He knew the dark side of humanity. He knew the interesting personalities that were engaging despite what they do. You know, these are really bad men. Goodfellas was the first mafia film of its time. Now, there's movies that have done this before. You can go back to classic films from even the 30s and 40s, crime gangster films that really humanize the people at the center of it and make you question your own morality at that. Even going back to Fritz Lang's film M, about a child murderer, is a complex look at morality and what's right or wrong. It's terrific. But what he does here... This is not a moral play. This is not a film about morality. It's just showing you what's happening. You know, it's not that Henry Hill's a good or bad guy. It's just that this is the guy he is, and you kind of have to come to your own conclusions on that. And it set a great standard for the genre to where you can make the bad guys likable. And this became a trend in the 90s with crime films that eventually did lead to The Sopranos, where Tony Soprano is a complete piece of crap, and everyone loves his character and James Gandolfini's performance. Then you get shows like Breaking Bad and all that. It all comes from Goodfellas in a lot of ways. Goodfellas is a big kicking off point for a lot of this stuff. Because when you can make the bad guys the main characters and entertaining, and you want to hang out with them because they're funny. And what's so genius about the structure of this film, for about the first half, you actually have a great time in this world. It's so entertaining. You feel like you're in it. You feel like you're one of the guys. You know, you're sitting at the table with them having fun. You know, you think, you know, Tommy's a little crazy, but he's a good guy. You know, and you're loving it. You love that scene where Henry gets the gun and beats the guy up for Karen. You love that scene. You're not like, wow, what a violent, mean act. You're like, yeah, go show that guy. Go teach him a lesson, you know? And then Karen gets the gun. It really turned me on. She looks at it, and it's like a photograph in her head. It's a memory that stays with her. Framing of this movie's genius. Key to young filmmakers out there about studying movies. Things like that really matters. Detail. Scorsese is obsessed with detail. The gun being in her hand and her looking at it and putting it in the box. Those are very minor things, small things that add so much to your movie. Don't just get so focused on plot and story and getting a pretty shot. It's not all about just getting a pretty shot or something that looks cool. The tracking shot in this movie isn't great just because it looks cool. It works in a very organic way to establish that Henry doesn't have to stand in line, that he goes the back way. He goes in another way, and everyone knows him. It shows you how Karen is seeing him. This is a very romantic moment, but it also shows how he's a mobster and he doesn't have to live in a normal way. He has to live. He goes in a different way. He has his own way of doing things. That's visual information. It's not just, hey, we could do a really cool tracking shot through this kitchen. They're not doing it for that reason. It has to have purpose. Give your shots meaning. If you don't give them meaning, then you're just a second unit director or a glorified cinematographer. You're not really a director. You're not telling a story. Your shots need to be telling story. What's in the frame is all the audience is getting. You're controlling their eye. You need to think wisely about what you want their eye to see, and you need to think what you want their ears to hear. The first half, though, you're so comfortable. It really tricks you. The opening's completely brutal, and you're like, "Whoa!" But then after that, my favorite part of this film is the early stuff. When he's a kid, and it's really, you can relate to it as someone who's a teenager when you feel out of place. When I first saw this movie as a teenager, I'm an adult now, but you can relate to it. Like, yeah, I do want to be around people that understand me, that are cool, that are older. And, it's not so violent then. There's only little moments like the guy getting shot and they wrap the aprons around him and stuff like that. It's not that big of a deal. And then there's about that halfway point with Spider, where Joe Pesci's character Tommy just goes crazy. And then the movie stops being comfortable, and it gets more tense as it goes on, and more tense until you realize this is what the life's actually like. It's not that fun and all that stuff. That's the illusion. But then what makes it great is by making the characters likable when the real stuff starts to happen, when it really becomes a mob story and you're thinking Henry's going to get killed, and you have those moments like, Karen, they wouldn't have found it, Karen, where he just sounds defeated. They wouldn't have found it. You feel it more because you like this guy early on, and now you don't know how to really feel, even though he made this grave for himself and he's really not that good of a dude. You still have sympathy for him because he's human. Because he has all the flaws and crazy things about him that are in all human beings to some degree. He's definitely a bit of a sociopath. They're all a little crazy. I'm not going to deny they're not crazy, but that's what's so great about watching this movie. There's always this layer of craziness under the surface. It all comes from these real guys that are really that way. And then these actors trying to kind of keep it contained within every scene. Because if you know how Scorsese directs, he doesn't actually direct his actors much. And this has been talked about a lot of sources. He knows everything in the shot, he knows what he wants, and then he just kind of lets the actors do what he wants, and he gets a lot of takes. And then he kind of cuts it together in the editing room and makes it really what he wants. He wants that little nuance of someone's eye. He likes the little, like I said, the details, man. You got to think about that stuff. And I'm not saying shoot a bunch of footage and cut it together. And you need a really good editor if you're going to do that. But he lets his actors live in this world. He creates the box, and the box is reinforced by all this real information, and then the actors get to play in there, And it feels a lot. It gives this feeling of an organic growth to all these scenes. None of these scenes feel forced or written. They don't feel like scenes that were in the screenplay. That everything was all those brilliant scenes with the great lines and all funny. But they don't feel like they were written out and thought out months before. It feels like they were making the movie. They had an energy they were getting. They were riding the energy of it. And it's even down in the details of the costume design, the ties that they have on. Marty was obsessed with the ties and getting the ties right. He was always adjusting their ties because it had to look that way that he knew the ties would look with the collar and everything. All those little things, it's all to screw with your eyes and how you perceive things and how you feel about things. That's when it's a great filmmaker and an artist. Scorsese's genius here isn't the story itself. Or how he put it together. That comes from the reality of it and everyone working on this. His genius is filling that stuff with cinematic flourishes that make you forget you're watching a movie while also being such a movie, such a cinematic experience that it's unforgettable and more engaging than most movies. There's a reason so many people love Goodfellas. It's because it's amazing. It's not overrated. It's not something that's a product of its time. It has not been surpassed by other crime movies. since it came out. It is a statement by a filmmaker with his worldview that he had developed with the story that was worth telling. As Scorsese said, he said himself in an interview on Charlie Rose about Kubrick, he said, "You really have to wait for a story that's worth telling. You really do." Those are wonderful words. Instead of just making a movie to make it, waiting for one that is the story you can tell. This was a story for him to tell. For him to tell with his abilities and with his mind and with this crew. To have De Niro still, to bring De Niro back in, to have Ray Liotta, it could have been so many actors, to have Pesci back in the folds. But the whole cast, the supporting cast, everyone's amazing. One of the greatest women ever in cinema. One of the most three-dimensional realistic women is Karen ever. One of the greatest performances in my mind by an actress ever is in this movie. She is just as, when you get the narration from her point of view, that you're in her head, you find out that she's even more complex than Henry in a lot of ways. And Karen and Henry's relationship is so fun to read about on the outside. You find out that that she might have been hooking up with women and he was hooking up with men. There's so much more to the story that the actual Paulie, the mob boss, was sleeping with Karen, and Tommy was I think he tried to rape her or something. Tommy was actually a lot worse in real life than he is in the movie. And he's terrible in the movie. Henry was actually scared of Tommy in real life. He was very scared of Tommy because Tommy was just, he was a tightrope act. He didn't know, it was very tense. But I think what I want to get at here is that when I first saw this movie as a teenager, what the whole point of this video is, what I'm getting at. When I was a teenager, I loved it in that way that everyone loves it. Where it was like, wow, these shots are amazing. I was first becoming a film buff at like 13, and when I saw this, I guess I was 14, 15. I watched it like 20 times. It was on TV a lot, so I used to watch it on cable. And I was obsessed with it. I was obsessed with the story. I thought the story was so good. Storytelling is something that is so hard to master. It's an easy to look at books and take classes, but it's so hard to master it in an elegant way. And I don't know if Marty ever was more elegant with the storytelling, because the way the scenes flow, everything just feels like there's a sense of time passing and feelings growing. The only thing is maybe the third act of Goodfellas, rightfully so, isn't as compelling as the first two acts. I agree with that. I like the third act stretch and what happens, but I'm definitely much more into the first half. But that's how a lot of movies go. And yeah, the ending's maybe a little disappointing. Maybe so, with Henry breaking the fourth wall and then he goes to live somewhere. But it's so, even that's kind of perfect. Really, because that's kind of how his life went on. It was exciting and fun in the early days, and then he kind of became a drunk failure of a guy that ends up on Howard Stern's show crying drunk, being that's really, at one time he was this guy who's up and coming, and then this is where he ends up. It's really the way to end the story. And that last image of Tommy with the gun looking like an old Hollywood gangster, looking like James Cagney or something, and then you have the Sex Pistols version of I Did It My Way. Come on, it's the juxtaposition of all those things. That's when it's Martin Scorsese really taking it to another place. But when I first was a teenager, it was that just generic love of movies. Then once you actually start reading about this movie and finding out how much of it actually did happen, and you actually read the book, and you see the interviews, and you watch the documentaries, and you find out, it changes your view on films in a lot of ways, because you realize that movies are just a collection of information to tell a story in a certain way. And it's the director's job to tell that story visually, but the story always kind of comes from a place of feeling. Movies are so much about feeling and what is right and wrong. That's where tone comes from. What tone is in a movie, when you feel what that movie is, when it's funny, when it's sad, when it's romantic, when it's scary, when you're tense. It's the tone gets created in that environment, in that box that the filmmakers make. And they had such a wonderful source to pull from, such a wonderful document of history to pull from, that they took that and they really did something that was, in my opinion, innovative. And I know other films had done things like this before. I'm not saying that this was the first film to really do this, but the way he brought that into the modern day, I still think is worth praising and looking at. And I still think that's why Goodfellas, despite some minor flaws that I didn't go into here, is a masterpiece. It is an absolute masterpiece. It's cocaine-fueled insanity. It's a fever dream of postmodernism meets classic Hollywood crime pictures. It's a filmmaker at the height of his powers with it's like when Spielberg made Schindler's List, and he made it like a documentary, and he had all these great stories from the Holocaust survivors. He had all these wonderful little compelling stories, and he made a movie like that, and he knew Oscar Schindler was interesting. Which sometimes the right story is just there. It's not always an original screenplay that is the sometimes a real life story, something, it has a narrative to it. It's the narrative that makes these filmmakers really excited. And you could tell that Martin Scorsese was in love with this narrative. He was passionate about it. And this film has energy and passion for a dozen movies. Dozens of films don't have even half the energy of Goodfellas. And films always try to mimic it and recreate it. And so many films are influenced by it. And it's a really good film to pull things from. I think City of God took a lot from Goodfellas, and it's amazing. I think they did a great job with that. Even the recent film I, Tonya with Margot Robbie is inspired by You'll see it a lot because the Goodfellas format works. Dense amount of narration, a lot of information, a lot of visual cues and details to reinforce your information, and that all just makes the story you're telling beat by beat richer, to where you feel like the film is probably saying more than it actually is. You probably give the film more credit, and it seems like it has more depth than it probably actually has. And I just love stories like that. Nicholas Pileggi says people come up to us like, "Man, you wrote that great scene, and good. You got nominated for an Oscar," and it's like, I didn't write that. And I think it's a testament to acting and what actors can bring with improvisation and with their performances in the art form of acting. I think it's a testament to what storytelling really is. And Goodfellas taking that approach is, it's funny. So many films that I love or that I spend a lot of time on, they have meaning. You study them to find more meaning or try to decipher them or figure out exactly. When I watch like a Kubrick film, I get something new from it every time I watch it. And ultimately, I think Kubrick is just trying to look at humanity at the end of the day, what human beings, and it's fascinating movie to movie. A lot of directors. Goodfellas isn't that kind of film. It's in a lot of ways it's very shallow. It doesn't have those extra layers for you to study the meaning of things or look for the depth or the philosophy in that. But that's the genius of it. So many films get weighed down by that, to where they forget to have the elegance of the storytelling. Goodfellas, like Scorsese said, you have to wait for a story that's worth telling. This is a story that demanded to be told. It's a story that's more than worthy of being told. It's a story that is necessary for a lot of people. These are compelling, wonderful, character-driven stories in their real form. And with the camera, they just become something that is the only thing I can compare it to is maybe, I don't know, the existential struggles of life, the human condition, thinking about death and your unhappiness and individualism and loneliness, the things that get evoked emotionally and thematically from Goodfellas does not come from just the director's vision and the artistry. It comes from the real world we live in, and that makes it more human. That makes it more painful, but in some ways, that also makes it more beautiful. Goodfellas is filmmaking at its finest, and it's storytelling in particular. Storytelling at its finest. Because it's a filmmaker that's mature enough to know that what you should put in that frame is necessary and important and worthy of the audience's time and attention. And it also shows that when you make a great movie, a truly great film, one that transcends so many films that do so many things right, it's because at the center of it, the story that you are telling, that narrative that you have, that character's journey you're taking, that world you put us in, is worthy of the celluloid. It's worthy of the camera, and it's worthy of a filmmaker of this power, and it's worthy of these actors, and it's worthy of everyone. And when everyone's hitting at the highest level, in all forms, and they have so much stuff to tell. This could have been a 6-hour movie. It could have been an 8-hour movie. It could have been a TV show. I mean, The Sopranos basically builds a TV show around this format. It just works. It just works. Okay? And it's easily one of my favorite films of all time. I'm shocked it isn't in the top 10. It's a solid number 12, though. Possibly even 11. I'm debating it right now, even. I love Goodfellas. Goodfellas isn't good. It's great. It's great fellas. Which I know is a bit cheesy, but I don't care. I get a little sentimental when I talk about movies I love, and I always go on here about feeling. I always talk about these films, Back to the Future, how the movie makes me feel, how American Graffiti makes me feel, and I try to add my own kind of personal context and my own life experience with it and how it affected me. But Goodfellas, I don't really care as much about that. I just want people to understand that it's a lot of it's true, and a lot of it comes from real things, and it is a great reason that you should have knowledge, that you should read more, you should learn more. The best filmmakers, all of them, were well read for the most part. Kubrick was very well. They were Bergman. They read. They were educated. They knew about history. They knew about philosophy. They read so much literature. They knew a lot, and that information, the amount of information you have, the more you know, the more you can provide for the audience and put into the frame and add to your movies. Scorsese isn't just a genius because he has a almost encyclopedia knowledge of film, and he's seen every movie ever and he can tell you everything. That's not just what makes him a genius, that information. It's that he knows a lot about the world. He knows a lot about a lot of things. He knows a lot about religion and Catholicism. So when he explores it in his movies, it's not just crappy, pseudo philosophy crap. He actually has something to say because it's coming from a real place. And I think what a lot of artists and filmmakers that I talk to, that I'm friends with, or I talk to, the problem is they're always so obsessed with being someone else. They want to be Tarantino, they want to be Kubrick, they want to be Spielberg. They want to be those guys, and they don't realize that those visions and those voices and those things that make those guys who they are come from a subjective personal place based in objective things. They take objective things, like, hey, dinosaurs are real, Steven Spielberg, and then he adds the Spielberg touch to it. That's those elements, and then Scorsese takes all of his things and adds them with this story. It's finding the right material for yourself and finding your voice and not trying to overreach or sell yourself short. And it's being educated, okay? Everyone's always so obsessed with the cinematography of movies. It's always a telltale sign when somebody's first getting into films. Their only thing they want to talk about is cinematography. They just want to talk about the lighting and the framing over and over again. I'm going to blow some people's minds. That's not the hardest part of making a great movie, is shots and editing and all that. That's stuff that is tough to do, and to do at a high level, it is insane. Don't get me, like, it's tough to make Blade Runner like Ridley Scott made it. I understand that. But there's a lot of films that look beautiful. Most movies today look good. The technology's there. Most films look really good today. It's really rare to go see a film that looks crappy anymore. Okay, even cheap films have a certain competency to them that didn't exist before. That's the thing about when you're a filmmaker, you're an artist, what separates, for me, the great ones, and what a lot of the young guys don't know, they get so obsessed with, I want to get a good shot, I want to get a beautiful shot and show people how pretty my movie is and show my cinematography and how good I am at that, and I want people to see how good my cuts are and how good my score is, and how well I do close-ups and these beautiful wide shots and what lenses I'm using, these deep focus lens, look at my lensing, look at all that. That's what we care about. But that's so many of the shallow technical aspects that you should learn, and that's part of it. You should always study. That's the thing, you should always study. And that's one element, but that's not the only thing you should study, because you're a storyteller, man. You're not just a cinematographer. You're not just an assistant director. You're not a second unit guy. You're a storyteller. You're a filmmaker. You make a film, which is a living thing. It is a story inside of this technical thing, okay? A song isn't just the production value and the music and the arrangements. It's the content, the lyrical content, and pathos that comes from the song. That's what's in there too. That's what makes a great songwriter, is the stories they tell. That's why people praise Bob Dylan. He wasn't the world's greatest singer. He wasn't the world's greatest musician even, but the substance in his music is there. It's inside of the music itself. The guy has things to say in there, because he did travel and reinvent himself and learn a lot about the world and experimented. It's all part of that, okay? You have to keep challenging yourself. The Beatles didn't do Sgt. Pepper's and Abbey Road and all that because they just became geniuses. They traveled the world, they learned more, they read more. They all of them became more educated, and that inspired those albums and those changes. Changes are going to happen just naturally. You're just not going to naturally become a great filmmaker. You're not going to just naturally become really good at something. The craft comes from the knowledge of it. Anyone can read and learn. It's only your fault for not reading and learning more. It's only your fault. There's no excuse when you want to do something like that to not put the effort into understanding it more. And everyone's so focused on making a good looking movie. They want their film to look good so they can get work and impress people and show how nice their music video is. And they forget that what makes a movie good is the storytelling and the flow and the pace and the tone and all that stuff, all these other elements that you can't just create with beautiful cinematography. Sure, the illusion of framing and what you do is how you create those things. You use the senses, you manipulate things. It's an optical illusion. It's like a magic trick. It plays with your head. I get that. But that isn't it. You have to have something inside that box. It can't just be a pretty box. There has to be something inside there. It's like when you read a book. It can't just be, oh, the prose are really good. That makes this a good book. No, it has to actually be a compelling book, too. It can't just be well written. It has to have something more than that. It can't, a lot of authors are great writers, but not every one of their books is a classic. It's because each story they tell is different. Not every book's going to be that one that's the perfect one, Or some people are better at plotting than they are at writing prose, but their plot's so good that maybe they don't need the great prose. Scorsese is not treating this film in a painterly fashion, like let's say David Lynch would. He's not treating it with this sense of humor like the Coen brothers has it in that way. He's treating it like it should be treated. He's treating it as if this is all happening while he's making it, that this is happening in that moment with the camera, with what your eye wants to see. And he knows that the strength of the film, all of the great things about it, is not coming from him doing that. It's coming from what's in there, from the inside, that makes it so good. And Goodfellas is not a great movie because it has all of those. It's not a great movie because of all that stuff that everyone talks about and focuses on so much, like the shot. It's great because the story is. I know I give you into this, but just learn that. That's the biggest lesson I had to learn in life. I loved Goodfellas one way when I was a teenager and I was first getting into movies. I love it in a whole new way now at 27. And that love comes from information and knowledge and reading more about it and learning more. And that will help you, not just as an artist, which is one thing, but as a person. It's always better to know more because that's how you structure yourself. And like going back to the sculptor thing, that's how not only you sculpt your films, but yourself into someone that's interesting. How are you going to make an interesting movie and tell an interesting story if you're boring? It doesn't really work. You have to have something going on in your mind, and you have to know what you're talking about when you talk about it. Anyway, that's all I got to say. Let's throw out some things here real quick, though. Scorsese's mother getting cast in that wonderful little sequence. The soundtrack, the use of the music, pretty much everything. The Atlanta song. It's one of the great soundtracks. The cutting of the movie. The way that it just has this quick pacing in every scene. The period detail, the costumes, the locations, all of that's impeccable. All of those things are part of why this movie's great too. You can't just make a movie that's great just because you have a good story. You have to have those things too, The acting's on another level. I mean, God, I just think about scenes of this movie sometimes. I think about when Henry wakes up and Karen's pointing the gun at his face, and I'm just like, holy crap! I hope that never happens to me. That's a scary thought. But that's life, and it feels real to life because that happened. So, much like that moment itself, it's almost like a statement of the movie. Scorsese is pointing the gun in your face, and he's asking you to look away, and you can't. And that's the genius of it. Anyway, thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.
He's gone. He's gone. And that's it.